Hi everyone, good afternoon. Mr. Luca Frumento is a senior here at Clemson studying political science with a concentration in political philosophy and a minor in economics. He's a member of the Clemson University Honors College and a Lyceum Scholar at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism here. He has completed the Hertog Foundation's Political Studies program and the American Enterprise Institute's Summer Honors program. He pioneered and is the president of Clemson's AEI Executive Council. In addition, he is a leader in the Catholic Student Association here and the Beta Upsilon Chi fraternity, and he has served on Clemson's Student Senate. Last summer, he studied at the Lorenzo de' Medici Institute in Florence, Italy, and he is fluent in Italian, or so he would have you believe. This summer, he will be completing the Hudson Institute's Political Studies Fellowship. On a personal note, I've had the privilege of calling Luca one of my closest friends over the past year. What Luca exemplifies every day in his personal, social, and academic life is a deep and unparalleled commitment to both the world of ideas and the world of people. Luca represents a rare ability to both sharply grasp the heights of philosophy and social theory, and to deeply care about and love the people around him, constantly weaving together the two worlds. His thesis is titled Friendship, the Self, and the Good in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and he'll be presenting from it today. Without further ado, Mr. Luca Frumento.
Wow, I'm going to shed a tear. Oh my goodness. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and for being here. The fact that you took time out of your busy schedules means the world to me. And thank you, Jack, for the really warm-hearted introduction. He is one of my closest friends. So I don't know what I'd do without you. I would like to thank the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism for hosting this event. I thank the Lyceum professors of this program for their time, their patience, and their passion for teaching young people like me. You all have made my time here at Clemson invaluable. I thank Dr. Hoffpower and especially Dr. Thomas for the immeasurable time spent talking through ideas and about life on topics ranging from The Sopranos or the latest gossip to love, my faith, ambitions, and happiness. I could not have asked for a better thesis advisor than you, Dr. Thomas. And since I'm here speaking about friendship, I also thank my friends that have decided to show up today for their love and support and for shaping who I am today. My theme is friendship. I chose to study friendship because I've often felt lost. Coming from New Jersey to South Carolina was a whirlwind of fun at first. But as I settled into college life, I became increasingly aware that very few people really knew me. My high school friends and I were close, very close. But upon leaving our nice town of Mendham, New Jersey, our proximity vanished, and we were all having new experiences that were changing who we were and lessening our former attachments. The busyness of school and the diversity of my involvements made any prolonged exposure to any one set of people here at Clemson actually quite rare. I joined a Christian fraternity, and I'm very grateful I did. Yet the friendships I've made, whether around campus, in the fraternity, or elsewhere, seemed a bit incomplete, and I did not know why. In the end of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he says that he discussed 4 major subjects: happiness, the virtues, friendship, and pleasure. Happiness is obviously the highest of subjects in the ethics. It begins and ends the work. It is, according to Aristotle, the ultimate end of human life. Virtue is discussed at great length because happiness to Aristotle at its core is activity in accord with virtue, whatever that may mean. But friendship gets 2 books to itself. It seems to me to be the warmest, the most moving, the most relatable, and the most human of the books. What is friendship's role in the good life, which we know involves happiness and the virtues and pleasure somehow? How does it relate to the other 3 subjects? How does it come about? And how can we experience it most fully. Aristotle begins by stating that friendship is a virtue or is accompanied by virtue. What Aristotle means here by virtue is specifically moral virtue, or action in accord with right reason for the sake of the noble. If friendship is a virtue, it is one of the various means to the ultimate end. If friendship is accompanied by virtue, then maybe it is the reward of virtue, somehow an all-encompassing good, converging with or close to happiness itself. Aristotle continues not with this kind of speculation, but by simply stating the following: everyone needs a friend. This is evident to all of us. Life without friends would be not worth living. But why? Friendship is so universal and so vital for our happiness, yet so unconscious that it merits further investigation. Aristotle observes that friendship is necessary among the wealthy and the powerful, as well as among the weak and the impoverished. Those with wealth and political offices need friendship, perhaps most of all, mainly to perform good deeds. Aristotle means to say that wealth and power are only choice-worthy insofar as we can benefit others. And here the link between friendship and virtue appears. The impoverished and the weak also need friends, as these people suppose that friends are their only refuge. The suffering that comes with misfortune is held to be alleviated by friends. Friendship for the young helps save them from errors of ignorance. Friendship for the old helps in the care they require in the frailty of body and mind. Friendship for the prime-aged enables one to act well. Here again, Aristotle links friendship to virtue, as a friend is one for whom one acts well. Aristotle also observes that friendship seems both natural and political. It seems to exist for parents and their offspring, and among the same species generally, especially among human beings. An instinctive relationship seems present among our families, our friends, and just among the human race, humanity. In contrast, friendship also seems to be political and hence artificial. The legislator is more serious about friendship than about justice, justice being written laws governing relations between human beings. For when people are friends, they are held to have no need of justice. Since the legislator aims to cultivate concord or unity and eliminate discord or disunity, the element of friendship most important to politics is like-mindedness, or homonoia in Greek. It seems that the legislator ought to extend friendship through the entire city to achieve this homonoia, or a unity, especially with regard to action. The question is whether friendship of the kind that eliminates the need for justice is possible to extend through the whole political community. Friendship is necessary for people of all ages and statuses. It seems to exist by nature of our being human, involuntarily, and in politics, voluntarily. Aristotle then states that friendship is noble. How so? Things universal and necessary are usually not held to be noble. Is the act of eating, for example, a noble thing? To Italians, maybe, but generally, no, because it is necessary and universal, therefore indistinct and not special. Friendship, however, rises as choice-worthy in itself, despite our universal need. One wonders how something with such lofty horizons can be shared among the weak and the strong, how of friendship even great men are in dire need, and how necessity does not blemish the crown status of friendship as noble in human life. These contradictions show that friendship is not limited to narrow definitions. Friendship is not understood on its own terms, but only in relation to the entire human being. The friendships from the beginning of Aristotle's discussion, like friendship's relationship to virtue, friendship as natural, political, noble, make what friendship is quite unclear. But we shall forge on. Now that we have an idea of how prevalent friendship is in human life, we must now describe what friendship exactly is. Aristotle gives us a framework through which to think about friendship. Friendship seems to involve love. It's evident to all of us. So, if we figure out what's lovable, then maybe we could figure out what this whole friendship thing is about. 3 things seem lovable to Aristotle: the good, the pleasant, and the useful. Regarding what we love, Aristotle states that it is not the good itself that we love, or the good for ourselves, but rather what appears to be good for ourselves. So, presumably, hopefully for the best person, these can align: the good in an abstract sense, the good for ourselves, and the good as it appears to us. But nonetheless, the fact that we may not love what is actually good for us means that not all friendship is created equal. Not all friendship aims towards the good, whatever that may mean. The apparent goods among men vary based on these 3 distinct lovable things, according to Aristotle, and therefore the aims of friendship vary as well. One loves another because, as opinion holds, he wishes for good things for that friend's sake. This is what Aristotle calls goodwill. This goodwill must be reciprocal for there to be friendship. We have goodwill for others based on one of the 3 aforementioned lovable qualities. The obvious question that arises is how we can love someone for his own sake on account of something lovable like pleasure or utility, and not the person himself. Notwithstanding this, we know now that our friendships have certain aims, and that these aims are threefold. Thus, there are 3 forms of friendship, according to Aristotle: the friendship of utility, the friendship of pleasure, and the complete friendship, or the friendship of virtue. The friendship of utility involves gaining benefit or advantage. The friendship of pleasure involves gaining pleasure. In these cases, the friends wish each other well, but only insofar as each can provide the secondary good at hand. Aristotle characterizes these friendships as incidental, as the useful and pleasant do not remain constant for any given person. Therefore, when the foundation of the friendship ceases or changes, so does the friendship itself. The old seem especially disposed to pursue their own utility, a bit curmudgeonly and unable to experience pleasure in the same way they did when they were young. The old seem especially disposed to passions and pleasure. These friendships, Aristotle holds, are, or seem to be, weak and volatile. Aristotle then introduces the complete friendship, which is the friendship of those who are good and alike in virtue. The complete friendship seems to involve virtue and equality. Since virtue is a stable thing, these friendships are not incidental. Contrary to virtue, or rather to utility and pleasure, virtue is steady and unchanging. In the complete friendship, each person involved is good simply and good for the friend, and the good is pleasant simply and pleasant to one another. Here, the good simply is virtue, and the pleasant simply is pleasure derived from virtue. While the incidental friends provide secondary goods, the complete friends come to share something in addition. The complete friends wish for good things for the other insofar as they are good, and they are good in themselves. Being good stands alone as lovable in itself. Aristotle states that the complete friendship possesses the good simply, the pleasant simply, and a likeness in these things. The good and the pleasant simply, meaning the good unqualifiedly, beyond particulars. The good and the pleasant for each as it appears to the complete friends, and the good and the pleasant simply, therefore, are or seem to be the same. The complete friends may not necessarily gain the good of virtue from each other, but Aristotle states that they delight in each other's characters. Delight that is not separate from their virtue, but rather a true part of it. Complete friendship is not merely about being virtuous in common. It is not about being virtuous in common merely, but rather about experiencing the good wholly, which may be the satisfaction that accompanies a good life shared. The role of pleasure in the complete friendship was once secondary, and perhaps still is, but transforms once Aristotle writes of the phenomenon of living together. We can think of living together literally, or as time spent in proximity, hanging out. What do the highest of friends do while living together? We can speculate now, but I think we'll get to that later. The old who pursue their utility do not frequently live with each other, but the young who share friendships of pleasure do. They like being around each other. It's a delight. Aristotle seems to imply that the young can reach something closer to complete friendship because they live together. The pleasant friendship, while incidental, is not zero-sum. It abounds when enjoyed. It does not deplete, as does the useful. For example, delighting in a witty friend, in his wittiness, is not finite. One will continually desire to be with a witty friend, for his wittiness does not lessen when shared. One will not always want to be with his grocery vendor, for example. Beyond the transaction of money for groceries, the friendship doesn't seem to be too choice-worthy. Living together characterizes not only the friendship of pleasure, but also the complete friendship. There exists the need in the complete friendship for the passage of time and the habits formed by living together. Here, the friends discover each other's character by dwelling with each other and acting together, eventually coming to love and to trust each other. Here, living together for the complete friends ends in trust in the other's character as good and not merely pleasure. Living together as both productive of, 1, pleasure, and 2, trust in the other's character, reflects the quality of friendship itself as both an activity and a characteristic. The activity of friendship, whatever it specifically entails, generally means living together. More specifically, according to Aristotle, this means passing one's days in delight with one another, passing one's days with others pleasantly. Aristotle describes the activity of living together as natural, for nature tells us to avoid what is painful and pursue what is pleasant. Living together for Aristotle is pleasant most of all. Living together for Aristotle is pleasant most of all. Aristotle goes as far as to write of living together that it is not possible to go through life with one another when people are not pleasant. It belongs to virtuous people least of all to be solitary. The virtuous seem to be self-sufficient and in the least need of pleasure, but somehow, some way, living together defines them most. The reason, I think, is something like the following. The friendship of virtue is not intelligible merely on virtue's terms, for the friendship of virtue without pleasure is not virtuous or choice-worthy at all. Later, when describing certain obstacles to friendship, Aristotle explains what he has been arguing implicitly throughout. The friendship of pleasure is indeed closer to true friendship than the friendship of utility. Aristotle states that although people can, quote, bear what is painful for a short time, no one can endure it continuously. Not even the good itself should it be painful to him. Aristotle's claim is something like, virtue can be painful, and sometimes it ought to be painful. But virtue without pleasure is not choice-worthy. Virtue without pleasure would not be part of what it means to live a whole good life. To Aristotle, living together, the pleasant, may be choice-worthy in itself. The question becomes, whence comes the pleasant and whence comes the good in the complete friendship? Aristotle, in my view, argues that the pleasant must come first, for the basic desire to dwell with another necessarily precedes any habits formed together and any knowledge of the other's character. I will say, I feel like this characterizes a lot of the friends I've made in the Christian fraternity. A lot of virtuous people coming together in common, but coming together before learning how or seeing if we can dwell together pleasantly. So, of course, we're not all going to get along based on the fact that we're Christian. To say pleasure is sufficient grounds for the highest friendship, though, would be incorrect. It is necessary, but not sufficient. The complete friendship distinctly involves character and choice. There is nature, which tells us to pass our days with each other pleasantly. Then there's virtue, which tells us to choose wisely our actions, actions which define our character and with whom we choose to be friends. I'm going to grab water for a second. The complete friendship involves wishing good things for the sake of the loved ones themselves, not based on a passion, but rather in accord with a characteristic. Wishing for good things for the other's sake is an act of choice based on the other's character. Both nature and will, therefore, are part of the complete friendship, both activity and characteristic. While Aristotle redeems the role of pleasure in the highest friendship, he condemns utility even further. He once stated that the useful is part of the complete friendship, but later states that the things belonging to complete friends are the good and the pleasant only. Aristotle questions the practicability of utility as an end in friendship. When utility is the aim, yes, and each comes to gain utility, it can last, but inevitably, I think Aristotle argues, accusations arise. For each inevitably deems themselves worthy of more benefit than the other provides. With a view to one's own benefit, friendship seems prone to failure. The problem of utility arises often in friendships of superiority. Among opposites, it is very difficult to have a shared common life. Even in the case of two relatively good people, they may be ultimately restricted to utility just based on the distance between them. For when one friend is superior to another, namely in virtue, the friendship ceases to be ruled by the dictates of friendship and is indeed ruled by the dictates of justice. The language of what each owes, what each is due, and the proportional affection given based on merit stands in tension with friendship. Aristotle seems to limit the friendship of superiority to the friendship of utility. They are friends, but only for what each provides. The king of a city provides benefit to his citizens, and the citizen provides honor and respect. It is similar in the case of a father and a son. You are not held to be best friends with your father. Aristotle thus argues that we do not wish our friends to become too virtuous, for if they outstrip us, we can no longer share a life with them. We may not wish for the greatest things for our friends. For example, that they be gods, because we want them to stay with us. We want our friends to be ours. But Aristotle states that friendship consists, quote, more in loving than in being loved. What of this? He provides the example of the mother who loves her child so much that she gives him away to be raised if others can raise him better. She loves her child so much that she expects no good in return. How beautiful. The mother's love is all-giving, totally self-sacrificial, which stands in contrast to the fact that we want our friends to be ours. We do not want them to leave us. Nonetheless, loving rather than being loved seems to distinguish higher friendships from the lower ones. For a love of this kind is impossible when each looks to their own benefit or pleasure. The question of friendship in the city, in my view, is here closed. This kind of love of the mother and her child, although an ideal and perhaps impossible, is impossible to bring about among the political community with its varied interests and ranks. Loving rather than being loved. Does this mean that we forget ourselves completely and have no consideration for me? Aristotle attempts to resolve the seeming conflict between love of oneself and love of another by exploring the origin of friendship itself. He begins with the claim that friendship arises from things, namely goodwill and like-mindedness, pertaining from oneself. In other words, we relate to ourselves the same way we relate to a friend. The decent person, for example, wishes and does good things for himself, for his own sake. More specifically, he does so for the sake of that thinking part of himself, which is in fact what each person seems to be most of all. He also wishes that he himself lived and be preserved, and especially that part of himself that thinks and with which he is prudent. There arises the idea of the thinking, prudent part of our soul, and we relate to it as we do a friend. These first two conceptions of friendship align most with the idea of goodwill. The decent person also goes through life with himself pleasantly, living together with himself by pondering memories of actions chosen and future things hoped for. He also shares in pleasures and pains with himself, as what is pleasant as well as what is painful for him is always the same and not different at different times. These latter conceptions of friendship align most with the idea of like-mindedness, as we are of one mind with ourselves, specifically concerning how we ought to act. The decent person is, therefore, without regret, for there exists within him a harmony between thought, desire, and action. Aristotle states that the friend is another self. The friend is another self. Aristotle turns to language of the self, which seems to be the authoritative part of the soul, that part which thinks and knows, perhaps not the good itself, but most certainly how to act in accord with the good. A friend serves as another one of these, implying that friendship may be necessary to act well and to think correctly. But since the elements of friendship seem to exist within oneself, the question arises as to whether it begins from within or if love of another, and rather, if love of another is an extension or expansion of self-love. We can answer this question by observing the base, or the ignoble, or those who are not virtuous. The base do not relate in any friendly way toward themselves. Their soul is torn by faction. Aristotle states that the base person must flee corruption with the utmost effort and attempt to be decent, since in this way he would be both disposed toward himself in a friendly way and become a friend to another. Friendship, therefore, requires to relate to oneself in a friendly way. We must love ourselves in order to love another. We must love ourselves in order to love another. To act in accord with the thinking part of one's soul seems to create the harmony of soul necessary for friendship. No more can we choose what appears to be good, but we must choose what is actually good, lest we fail to love ourselves and fail to have friends as a result. So, Aristotle posits that friendship stems from oneself. What does this look like? exactly. Aristotle gives 3 good images of how loving another and loving oneself are congruent. First, he likens loving a friend to an artisan who loves his work. The artisan takes pride in what he makes. Likewise, the good friend in the activity of friendship makes his friend better and feels satisfaction in looking upon the work that is his friend. Furthermore, since we exist through activity, we are active toward our friends, feeling affection for one's work, one's friend, essentially means feeling affection for one's own existence. Aristotle writes that the maker of something somehow is the work. So we affirm our own existence by benefiting and making a friend to behold. Second, Aristotle gives us the image of the self-lover. Ought one love oneself or another more in friendship? Aristotle questions the commonly held wisdom that self-lovers are those who lie, cheat, and steal for their own benefit, while good people love their friends for their friends' sakes and look not to themselves at all. Actually, says Aristotle, whoever acts in accord with the virtues, which entails benefiting others, secures for himself what is noble, and he is a true self-lover. The greatest good is that which accords with the thinking part of himself, this good being the noble. The noble. The complete friends will compete to act well toward each other, striving to reach the noble through their friendship. The noble is not a tangible good. It is simply the beautiful thing. The self-lover, the noble man, therefore, will die for his city and his friends. He will give up money, political offices, and honors, not for the city, but for his friends. He will even let his friend perform certain noble actions, for being the cause of his friend's noble deeds and beholding them is somehow more noble than doing these deeds himself. Here arises the question of what moral virtue entails and what this means for friendship. The height of moral virtue in the previous chapters is the magnanimous man. He is the most virtuous person in the city, performs virtuous actions in accord with his superior abilities, and receives honors accordingly, all for the sake of the noble. What of this? The noble here is doing the opposite. It is stepping back and beholding another. If the aim of the complete friendship is moral virtue, what of this friend who gives up the chance to be morally virtuous? The magnanimous man, yes, does live only, quote, with a view to a friend, but does this mean that beholding the moral action is better than the moral action itself for the morally virtuous person? Aristotle, in my view, answers this tension between moral virtue and friendship in the next chapter. For the first time in the entire discussion of friendship, he asks about the happy person. He speaks now of happiness and not the noble. He asks whether the happy person will need friends. The answer, obviously, is yes. His reason? The happy person is held to possess all that is good, and friends are the greatest external good. Well, if we look back to the section on magnanimity, Aristotle states that the greatest external good is honor. Is recognition from the city really higher than recognition from one's friends? Notwithstanding this, we now know that here we have a new conception of the good life, either one that qualifies the parameters of moral virtue or one that perhaps transcends moral virtue. I, perhaps mistakenly, suggest that it is the latter. He writes in the same section that happiness lies in living and being active, and through friendship we are better able to contemplate the actions of serious men to act well ourselves. Good action, therefore, requires others to contemplate. Therefore, the solitary person will not be happy, for it will be nearly impossible for him to act well without others. But you ask, we're speaking here of action, moral virtue. Aristotle goes a step further. The activity of living, he states, authoritatively seems to be perceiving or thinking. The distinctive characteristic of human beings is that we could think and perceive, and perhaps this activity is choice-worthy most of all. To live now, according to Aristotle, is to perceive. If he who sees perceives that he sees, he who hears perceives that he hears, and he who walks perceives that he walks. He thus perceives that he is active. But we could also perceive that we perceive and think about thinking. This would mean perceiving that we exist. The activity of living foremost is perceiving that we exist here. And subsequently, that others too exist. We ought then to participate in the most choice-worthy thing, perceiving we exist with our friends. What would this entail? Doing so would entail, quote, sharing in a community of speeches and thoughts, for this is what living together would seem to mean in the case of human beings. Living together, now we know, specifically entails dialogue and thoughts. It seems evident. The most characteristic activity of friendship seems to us to be conversation. We like talking with our friends. We may perhaps also call this activity, if we were so presumptuous, philosophy. He mentions at the end of his discussion on friendship a possible form of shared perception, shared perceiving, that we exist, and it would be to philosophize together. So, what are the heights of friendship? Well, if we hold that friendship is absolutely essential to our ultimate end of eudaimonia, or happiness, then what is happiness? To Aristotle, the good life, and the ultimately most choice-worthy and happy life, is the contemplative life, which he earlier defines as the scientific study of things pertaining to the cosmos, separate completely from human action. The complete friendship, while at first founded on moral virtue, seems problematic, for beholding good action instead of doing it may be more choice-worthy, and the activity of perceiving and engaging in a community of speeches and dialogue may be more choice-worthy than moral virtue itself. Perhaps the highest friendship is the philosophical friendship, a friendship aimed toward intellectual virtue. Perhaps friendship is the bridge between moral and intellectual virtue, loosely speaking, or the political and philosophic ways of life. But is moral virtue necessary to reach these heights, or is this a completely separate enterprise? I don't know, but yeah, I guess that's for us to investigate further. Does the philosopher need friends in order to contemplate? From the discussion on friendship, it seems to be the case. But I'll leave us with this. Aristotle writes of the contemplative life, quote, although it is perhaps better to have those with whom he may work, nonetheless he, the philosopher, is most self-sufficient. The philosopher can and often chooses to contemplate alone. To be active in accord with the intellect seems to be dearest to the gods. But is this possible? Are these heights possible without friendship? And I think the most important question we ought to ask is, are these heights of the contemplative life even worthwhile without sharing them with friends? That's all I got. Thank you. All right. right. Well, if you guys have questions, I can answer them. Or at least try. Hi, Quentin. Yep.
So, you mentioned toward the beginning that Aristotle has, because of the role of pleasure in friendship, a certain optimism about friendship among the young and a certain skepticism about friendship among the old with utility, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we also know that in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that philosophy can really only be done by old men, and the young men, there's something that they sort of can't, they sort of don't have the experience yet.
Yeah.
To do philosophy. And yet we see toward the end of your talk that there's a centrality to contemplation of philosophy and there's friendship.
Sure.
So how do we square that circle?
Well, I guess that just gets the question of whether true, complete, full friendship is actually possible for those that participate in the contemplative life. It's ambiguous, and as I investigate further, I get a bit pessimistic because for those in the contemplative life, the most choice-worthy thing is thought and investigation into things that are apart from humans. So, ought one to do that? Perhaps the highest friendship is discussing metaphysics with your homeboys or something. But, and this also gets to the question of whether old people can experience a kind of pleasure. I think they can, but yet it's also ambiguous. So I guess, yeah, the question of whether philosophy and friendship are even compatible would be one to investigate, and one that I have not a really good answer for right now. So
a lot of this really seems to hinge on the idea of love.
sure.
Love of oneself, love of another, love. Take your pick. How does Aristotle, how does Luca Frumento understand love?
Well, I think that I love love. That's all I'll say on my end. But I think Aristotle sees love as wishing for good things for the other's sake. And what that entails is different for every person. But yeah, I think it's a combination of the friend actually being good enough to love, being lovable, and then seeing something in that friend that brings you somehow to want good things for them. I think we've all seen or experienced that before. You see someone and you're just like, I want them to succeed because it would be good for me somehow for them to succeed. And that's what Aristotle attempts to answer in these two books. So, yeah.
You said earlier
Mm-hmm.
that, among opposites, it's very difficult to have a common life or form a sense of or share a common good.
Sure.
And that was in the context of relationships of superiority.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if there are any other characteristics that you think might disqualify somebody from sharing that vision and what sort of impact.
So, I guess your question is, are there more instances where the friends, whoever they may be, might come to share different things or come to be opposite, and if they could be friends?
Yeah, where it's difficult to form that sense of like-mindedness.
Sure.
Seems to be so.
Yeah. I mean, there are instances where I think like-mindedness concerning action would be different for each if they come to gain or delight in different things. I guess the example would be the lover and the beloved. The lover expects, the pleasure and the honor from them for the person that is beloved, and the beloved expects and desires to be loved. And whether this is complete friendship, whether it is somehow friendship, but because of the nature of who they are and what they desire in relation to themselves, they don't reach friendship's heights. And you could think about that in a variety of other instances of opposites too. So.
Yeah, I was wanting to ask that this whole question comes up in political philosophy, the difference between Aristotle and modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument, as I have heard it in various forms, but that Aristotle seems to assume a certain limited range of human beings who are healthy, solid, sensible, common sense, fair, at least to start, and then they build up their virtue and so on. But that the modern focus is more that that's not helpful because human beings in the main are very chaotic and psychopathic. And
Sure.
that today we would have any number of people pointing out with Asperger's and ADHD and learning whatever they would say about all the weird things that people are, and that because that's the kind of starting point for moderns, that we're all nutcase,
Mm-hmm.
not too far under the surface, so that the Aristotelian vision, say compared to someone like Dostoevsky or someone like that, a more completely modern mind, to say, well, it's all very noble and sweet, but it just won't fly for the loony-toony world of modern man, where he's just too screwed up and neurotic to deal with himself, let alone other people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
So I guess at the heart of your question, comparing Aristotle and the more classical thinkers to modernity, is that Aristotle believes that nobility in some form is possible, and that we moderns believe that humans are irredeemable in some way, just, and it's not even worth trying to get them to act or be a certain way because it's all a bunch of baloney and ideal that's not possible, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and then you mentioned about in the Christian community, you're all in for Christ and so on.
Sure.
But you end up having these things which you don't want, but you just end up having conflicts because
Mm-hmm.
one guy's got something going on, and the other person's got something going on, and it just doesn't pan out. Yeah.
Well, to the Christian question, I guess that would get to you'd have to ask the question of, do Christians really believe that all humans are irredeemable? And I guess if I were to speculate, the example of the saints means that there are a select few that are redeemable in some way. And the same thing with regard to moral action with the ancients and the moderns, I guess. Yeah, it's not for everybody, but you could look to people that have displayed these heights of being. The first person I think of is like a statesman, a Churchill, Lincoln. And although they were flawed people, they ultimately acted well for the sake of the noble, given their circumstances. So perhaps it really is, perhaps the ancients are right, where you read your stuff and you have a good education and you act well and you have the necessary equipment and fortune, then you really can reach the heights of being. So. Mm-hmm. Sure.
I guess I'm just wondering how you and Lyceum or Aristotle would distinguish between like romantic love and
Mm-hmm.
like the love shared between friends.
Well, romantic love entails not sharing or delighting in necessarily the same things like the lover and beloved. And I guess it's different because, well, I guess the friendship of virtue is different in that perhaps love, romantic love is not as stable as virtue. So that's an argument. But if it is, then even you with whoever partner you have, are you delighting in the same things? Do you have a common aim? Perhaps, but it probably looks a lot different for romantic people. So.
I have two questions. One sort of building off of what
Sure.
everyone else has done. Can men and women be friends? Is my friendship with you like fundamentally different from my friendship with, say, Emily? And then the other thing is, you talked about at the beginning why friendship matters to you. What have you learned from your study of friendship that has deepened your friendships in your own life?
Sure. Well, I think Aristotle, I spoke about in my talk, he lists that which belongs to the decent person in relation to himself, the things of goodwill and like-mindedness, those of goodwill being wishing for good things for one's own sake, and also wishing that oneself actually exists and be preserved. And I guess this sort of relates to your question too, Emily, about romantic lovers. They do have that often for each other. And then we get to like-mindedness, which is choosing the same things as another, passing one's days together and with oneself and with another pleasantly, and sharing in pleasures and pains. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I guess the question one ought to ask is, are men and women, do they share the same pleasures and pains, or do they share different pleasures and different pains at different times? Also, what would, I guess, virtuous action entail for a man and a woman? I think a good example we could think about in this regard is courage. Is courage for a man and a woman the same thing? Courage for a man, I think, is best exemplified in war. So, I don't know. But, yeah, so I guess we'd have to go investigate those questions. And as to whether, or what I've learned from Aristotle that's helped deepen friendships, I guess, I'm not the most morally virtuous person, and most people aren't. But I guess I look out at and from personal experience at all of my friends, and I think my closest friends are those that I'm able to think and philosophize with, as well as share pleasure with, and get into some trouble if, I don't know. But yeah, so I guess it's really allowed me to look out upon the landscape of my friends and see who's really the realist, I guess. So.
I wanted to return to a few separate things
Sure.
that you articulated. So Aristotle's notion of the second self,
Mm-hmm.
that a friend is like a second self. And whether we contemplate the highest good that we want to attain is the contemplative life,
Mm-hmm.
or the virtuous action, do you think that in Aristotle there might be a sense that connects back to something else that you touched on, of that value of seeing what you contemplated yourself as being virtuous in another,
Mm-hmm.
as a way of, when you were talking about perception,
Mm-hmm.
you do perceive yourself walking when you walk. You do perceive yourself perceiving even.
Mm-hmm.
You have a kind of meta level analysis of your own process.
Sure.
But do you think that Aristotle finds a particular value in being able to truly externalize that, as opposed to it being a completely internal contemplation, in the form of a friend,
Mm-hmm.
that they can, in a way, represent the best in yourself that you can observe?
Sure. I think that is correct. I think through perceiving who we are and our good qualities, when we see good qualities in another, I think that's in Book 9, Chapter 5 about goodwill, that's sort of like a spark. You see the noble and beautiful, and you know it somehow, and I guess you know it by how you relate to yourself and the authoritative part of your own soul. And I guess a following question from that would be whether you need a friend to be good, whether the way you think about good action is informed by others or seeing it in others. And I think that's what Aristotle's getting at with regard to the other self. When you see goodness in others, not only is friendship an extension of your own goodness and self-love, but perhaps it returns into you.
Yeah, it's not just you're seeing that in your friend, but that your friend is making that observation of you. That
Exactly.
you're being seen in your version.
Yes, and that gets to the question of, I guess when I asked, would the magnanimous man rather be honored by the city or his friends, think that we perhaps act well because we are seen by our friends. And this gets to the motivation of being virtuous generally. And I posited that perhaps, or just suggested, that friendship is the reward of virtue. And that's what that would mean. Like, why do you act virtuous? Is it for virtue's sake? Is it so you can be friends with other people and enjoy and share life with them? It's a question, so.
If that's the question, why is not friendship one of the three things that is said to be the good? At the very beginning of the book,
Mm-hmm.
when we have, honor, pleasure, or virtue,
Mm-hmm.
is competing for the status of the good. So I'm wondering in your talk throughout if you underrated the good
Mm-hmm.
as the object throughout, especially because of the elevation of the noble throughout your talk.
Sure.
So isn't it, let me ask it plainly, isn't all of this about the good and foremost about my good? And that's it? Not about friendship for friendship's sake, but about me and my good.
Well, I think friendship ultimately is aimed at the good and necessarily must be aimed at the good. And those who are virtuous see as their own good the good unqualifiedly. So therefore, friendship is a study of the third of those three things, the virtues. Somehow virtues and moral or just activity in accord with the good is intimately connected to friendship. Somehow our being good and our good for ourselves is intimately connected with others. So I was sort of floating around ideas that would seem to point to the conclusion that friendship is a good in itself. And you say, well, isn't it the good that's the object? And I think you're right. And I guess I would ask whether these are congruent or the same or similar. So, and if they are, that would just be absolutely beautiful, a very beautiful idea. I can't confirm or deny it right now, but yeah. Yeah, you can follow up.
Could I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So then, when we're, the height of contemplation of 10:7,
Mm-hmm.
if you contemplate that which contemplates itself, that was this question's terrible. When you contemplate
God.
that which contemplates itself, do you think you're friends with that thing? To be clear, are you friends with God?
Yes, yes. Yeah, and our discussions about Socrates and the wise old men and his friendships as reading with his friends, picking out something and talking about it, and whether it's ambiguous as to whether he's speaking of friends as the people that are around him in flesh or with the wise old men. I think it's a similar thing, where something so viscerally apart from you, whether we can be friends with that thing that's so high. yeah, and this also gets, I'm speculating, but this gets the question of, I guess, Jesus Christ himself as Father and also as friend who came into this world as a baby and lived among us. So, can we be friends with God? Well, he's judge and merciful. He's a judger and one who's merciful. So I guess if he judges you, wouldn't that mean that you're not equal, you can't share in the same things in common, that the things of his world are ultimately different than the things of your world? But yeah. Is that a satisfying answer, or what's not satisfying about it?
What's Aristotle's answer? What's Christ's answer?
I think that Aristotle would say that I guess in him saying that we don't want our friends to be gods, that no one would choose to possess every good by becoming another, let's say, a god. That would be the answer to your question.
So what about the other side of friendship, the side involving shared vice, shared degeneracy, shared loyalty, but also shared weakness, shared failure, shared sickness? I mean, I can think of a couple possible resolutions, right? Like, because we hear a lot about virtuous friendship. Like, one is maybe that Aristotle's concept of virtue is so foreign to our own concept of morality that this question doesn't apply. Another is maybe this is all can be just sort of collapsed into the pleasant bit. Or is it either of those, or is it something else?
Well, Aristotle speaks about the corrupt and the base and how perhaps he says that the base really in the long run can't be friends. They can't be friends with anyone because they can't even relate to themselves in any friendly way. But for a time, the base are corrupt and they delight in the corruption of others. And for that time that they delight in each other's corruption, they are friends. So Aristotle's not limiting friendship to one thing. It's much varied. And I'd say that is where your thing lies. I guess the question then would be, well, aren't some people good at some times and corrupt in other times? Can't you be bad at one moment and then good in the next? Or, I guess, I don't know. To Aristotle, it's no, because ultimately the person that is bad, base, corrupt, their soul is torn, and they're never able to direct themselves toward the good, whatever that may mean. So, yeah. Is that satisfactory?
I think it's as satisfactory as Aristotle can get you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Luca.
Sure. Thank you guys so much.